Welcome to the 2022 C. Henry Smith Peace Oratorical Contest. My name is Anna Groff, and I'm Assistant Professor of Communication and new Director of this annual contest. Thank you all for joining us in the Humble Center tonight and on the live stream. You all are a part of continuing this long tradition of speech-making on campus. An intercollegiate peace association contest was first held here more than a century ago in 1907, and Goshen College students have been speaking their minds on peace and justice issues ever since. We're pleased to have the finisher from last year's contest with us, Denise Aguilar. Denise went on to finish second in the binational contest sponsored by Mennonite Central Committee in the US and Canada for her speech, Living the American Dream on Borrowed Time. I'd like to thank Grayson Cockerham, Senior Sport Management Major, and Dwayne Stolzfus, Chair of the Communication Department, for serving as judges in the preliminary round in January. And a special note of thanks to Dwayne, the previous contest director, for all of his support for this year's event. We're grateful to Adrienne Nesbitt, a Goshen College graduate with a theater background and currently event coordinator at iDart Creative Studio in Goshen. She served as a one-on-one speech coach with the finalists last week. Just a note, we ask you to stay masked for the event, and speakers will remove theirs during their speeches. Let's turn to our three judges for the contest tonight, and I'll ask each one of them to stand during their introductions, and we can save applause until all three of them have been introduced. Julia Gingerich. Julia has served as a pastor at 8th Street Mennonite Church since 2015. Prior to her role at 8th Street, she has worked with the Victim Offender Reconciliation Program at the Center for Community Justice in Elkhart. Her peace and justice efforts include Indigenous solidarity work and immigration advocacy. She has a bachelor's degree from Eastern Mennonite University and a Master of Divinity from Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary. She volunteers with the Reentry Housing Program of the Elkhart County Jail Ministry. In her free time, she enjoys biking, traveling, and spending time with her husband and 2 daughters. Next, Robert Brenneman. Robert is a professor of criminal justice and sociology at Goshen College. His research focuses on the impact of violence on human flourishing. In his first book, Homies and Hermanos, God and Gangs in Central America, Brenneman interviewed 63 former gang members from Central America to understand the process of leaving the gang. His latest co-authored book, Building Faith, A Sociology of Religious Structures, explores the ways that buildings impact community. He enjoys biking, playing the mandolin, and teaching Sunday school. His best and worst oratorical performances have occurred as a fan at college basketball games. And finally, Jana Hunter-Bowman. Jana is Associate Professor of Peace Studies and Christian Social Ethics at Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary. She brings experience as a peace and justice worker in a variety of settings to her academic study and teaching roles. She has worked with Witness for Peace and Justapaz in Colombia. She has a bachelor's degree from Goshen College and a Master of Arts in Peace Studies from AMBS. At the Kroc Institute at the University of Notre Dame, she was the first student to combine the disciplines of theology and peace studies into a single program. This led to her first book, which examines the agency of victims of violence in Colombia's war zones. Her current research project with Movimiento Cosecha focuses on the political agency of undocumented immigrants. Thank you, judges. And now join me in recognizing our judges for this evening. Now we turn to our 4 finalists this evening. They passed through a preliminary competition last month. They have worked hard, shaping and polishing their speeches. And to give you a sense of their preparation, I will name just a few of the steps. They received direct feedback from judges in the preliminary round and written comments on their manuscripts from the communication department. They met with at least one faculty member for additional suggestions. They watched videos of previous speakers. They worked individually with the speech coach, and they went through a final private practice session on stage this afternoon. They have invested deeply in their speeches, as will be evident shortly. And a quick note that the order of speakers for tonight was determined by a random drawing. Our finalists each prepared a short bio to be shared as a part of the introduction. And speakers, please stand one at a time as I introduce you, and we'll hold the applause until all four have been introduced. Our first speaker is Caleb Gingerich, a junior history and writing major from Kalona, Iowa. Caleb works as a writing mentor on campus and is a Pinch Penny Press board member. This summer, he volunteered with San Antonio Mennonite Church and worked with refugees and asylum seekers. Our next speaker is Ebtihal Abdelaziz, a senior mathematics and physics major from Cairo, Egypt. She leads the astronomy and math clubs and has a leadership role in the International Student Club. She participated twice in Maple Scholars and has worked with the South Pole Telescope collaboration as part of her internship with Fermilab last year. Our third speaker is Greta Lapp Klassen, junior English and art major from Goshen. Greta served as executive editor of the record this fall. She has been a member of Voices of the Earth and the orchestra. Also a member of the Goshen Monologues Committee and the English Department's Horswell Fellow this year. Bryan Hernandez Rodriguez is our final speaker. Bryan is a junior computer science and sustainability studies major from Goshen. He's a first-generation college student who has served as Student Senate President and event coordinator for the Commuter Student Association. He was also a finalist for the StoryCorps speeches as a first year. Join me in welcoming our four finalists to the competition. Now we listen to these four speeches, these four personal meditations on timely themes of peace and justice. I invite you to tuck your devices away and listen closely as our speakers share with us, beginning with Caleb and then following the order listed in the program.
Around 20,000 years ago, humans began migrating across the Bering Land Bridge that connected northeastern Asia to what we now call North America. Or perhaps, as recent theories suggest, humans traversed the Pacific Ocean across the western coast even sooner than that. Regardless, these hunter-gathering peoples soon spread across the entire continent. As they traveled, they learned how to live on the land that they inhabited. They discovered tall mountains, lush forests, grassy plains, dry deserts, and much more. They invented agriculture, leading to the production of bountiful amounts of food. Some settled in one place while others migrated elsewhere, and what started as relatively small packs of people soon blossomed into many peoples, each with their own distinctive identities. The institution of agriculture in all corners of the continents helped contribute to the development of diverse languages, religions, economies, governance, and arts. Civilization was born, and the land was full of it. The peoples developed extensive routes and roads that connected one to another through the trades of good and culture. As populations grew, peoples came into conflict with one another. Territorial battles were occasionally fought, but diplomacy developed as a means to combat the violence of war. The peoples didn't always get along, but for the most part, they respected each other and were able to coexist relatively peacefully. Then, one day, Europeans arrived on the coasts of the land. These new people were after land and wealth. They kidnapped and enslaved the indigenous peoples they encountered, forcing them to collect gold for their monarchs across the sea. When the peoples began to resist their oppressors, they were murdered en masse. And soon more invaders arrived, landing and settling on the eastern coasts. All the peoples the settlers encountered soon learned of their violent nature as they continued their march inland. They forced native peoples out of land they had inhabited and cultivated for generations. The descendants of the first settlers created a nation which espoused that all men are created equal. However, the nation's main priority was the ethnic cleansing and genocide of the Native Americans in order to make room for more white settlers. They signed land treaties with indigenous peoples and broke them, invading native land time after time and removing people from their homes. The white settlers' descendants stripped indigenous peoples of their sovereignty. They destroyed native foodways, thus creating a dependency on the insufficient rations gifted to them by the government. They stole indigenous children from their parents and educated them to be white, depriving them of their traditions, languages, and values. Such acts of cultural genocide were justified in the minds of white people as a civilizing process. In order to be civilized, one must accept the Christian God and faith. So many residential schools worked to convert indigenous youths under the pretext of salvation. I love stories. Sorry about that. Good stories hold much authority within them. The stories we tell about ourselves inform us and others of who we are, our identity. Our stories that we pass down culminate in who we are, what matters to us, how we interact with those around us, and how we feel about ourselves. However, what happens when we realize that the stories we tell about ourselves, our history, are not objective? History is not objective. History is not written by some transcendent being devoid of bias. The stories we hear, learn, and recite are all written by humans, and imperfect beings write imperfect histories. Just as history is not objective, nor is it apolitical, how we write the stories have a profound effect on those who inhabit them. I imagine that not many of us here have heard the story I opened with, that history, told like that before. And while that story is incomplete, I'd like everyone to imagine how different everything, and I truly mean everything, would be if that story was the prevailing Genesis narrative of the United States rather than the deceitful, whitewashed alternative we all grew up with. These stories of land theft and cultural genocide of Native Americans were absent from my curriculum for the same reason that indigenous perspectives were removed from the origin stories of this country. Ignoring historical reality allows us to forget the past and ongoing violence perpetrated against indigenous peoples, thus protecting our perceptions of ourselves. We seek comfort in the stories we tell about ourselves, even if that means rejecting truths. I encourage settler descendants like myself to reject this approach. We must embrace the reality of our problematic and violent history and allow it to haunt us. We cannot even begin to be authentic in our proclaimed solidarity with oppressed groups if we do not first acknowledge our participation in their oppression. We must also be active in our pursuit of justice. Indigenous peoples of these continents are still resisting settler violence, whether it be land treaty infringements, insufficient food supply, or the human rights crisis of missing and murdered indigenous women. We must fight against the effects of settler colonialism, and that begins with honestly retelling our collective history. Growing up, I too learned and recited stories about myself. I was raised in a Mennonite community, and from an early age was enveloped in this notion of Mennonite exceptionalism. I remember constantly hearing anecdotes that highlighted our collective goodness, like Mennonites were some of the first to oppose slavery. I memorized the story of Dirk Willems, an Anabaptist, who saved the life of his captor, even though it cost him his own. I knew Mennonites to be good people dedicated to nonviolence. As I got older, I learned of realities that shattered my purest image of who Mennonites are. I had never learned of Mennonite mission work with Native Americans. I was alarmed to discover that in the 1970s and 80s, while my parents were alive and growing up, Mennonite missionaries ran and operated residential schools in Ontario, Canada. Mennonites viewed their work in these schools, converting indigenous children to Christianity, as, quote, warfare against Satan. These actions, perpetrated by Mennonite missionaries and thousands of others, were rooted in the belief of indigeneity as barbarous, uncivilized, and in need of salvation, all of which are tenets of the white supremacist ideology that rules settler colonial relations with Native peoples. My learning of such violent histories forced me to reevaluate my understanding of what it means to be Mennonite and the role I play in that ongoing story. I was forced to somehow reconcile the image I had of my faith community growing up with the reality of Mennonites as perpetrators and perpetuators of structural violence, a difficult but necessary process if we are to be honest storytellers. Yet, violence perpetrated against First Nations peoples does not magically disappear when we face our true history. Actively pursuing justice means putting our money where our mouth is. We must stand in solidarity with Indigenous peoples in their struggle to gain back their sovereignty, and that means providing reparations. Reparations means making amends for a wrong that has been done by paying money to or otherwise helping those who have been wronged. Inviting Indigenous peoples into our communities and centering their experiences are essential in deciding how to provide reparations. The Mennonite Church in Columbus, Ohio, the faith community I most identify with, the Anabaptist Mennonite tradition, is just beginning to establish practical steps of providing economic reparations. The Columbus Mennonite Church in Ohio recently voted to establish an annual fund of $20,000 to be donated to Black or Indigenous-led organizations, no strings attached. If a church of roughly 300 members can practice direct economic reparations to support Indigenous self-determination, why can't the congregations in our communities? There can be no peace without justice, and there can be no social justice without economic justice. How then can we claim to value peace without actively pursuing justice through the form of reparations? The settler descendants alive now did not instigate land theft through violence, nor did we create untruthful histories, but we inherited them nonetheless. Now that this legacy belongs to us, it is our decision to make. Will we do nothing, therefore perpetuating settler violence against Indigenous peoples? Or will we retell our histories and begin to make amends in hopes of a peaceful resolution? In my mind, there is only one way forward: the path towards reconciliation. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I have a burning question. How many of you have taken a science class, say in middle school or high school? So virtually everybody. How many of you felt that the entire point of the class was to memorize a lot of facts and maybe just use them for exams? Me too. For a long time, I felt this way too. And I love science, by the way. But at some point, we started learning about atoms, and the entire way I saw science changed completely. You see, take this pure fact, for example. All matter in the universe is made up of exactly 12 elementary particles that cannot be divided into anything smaller. On first glance, that may not seem remarkable, but if you dig deeper, you can truly understand what it means. It means that you, I, the chairs, the buildings, the stars, the galaxies, are virtually made of the same things. It's the universe's way of telling us that we're all connected. What's even more remarkable is that our form of matter is only 5% of the mass of our universe. If you're wondering what the rest of the universe is made out of, you're not alone. pretty much everybody in science wonders too. This is one of the hardest questions we have in physics right now. We give it names like dark matter and dark energy, but at the end of the day, nobody has detected it, and nobody actually knows what it is. And this makes me so very excited. I want to go join a collaboration and be involved in the process of understanding what is the majority of our universe is. And I think this fire is inside every one of us. It could manifest itself when you're trying to solve the word of the day on Wordle, or potentially if you're trying to prove that aliens do exist. Valid reasons for both things. Yeah, and I think this fire has led humans as well to solve all sorts of problems through history and to collaborate. And to prove this to you, we have to go back in time. So let's just ignore physics for a moment and imagine we're back in time, exactly 4,000 years ago. We're in a battlefield. One of Egypt's best kings ever, King Ramses II, was trying to free an Egyptian city, the Egyptian city of Qadish. It was taken over by a new rising empire, the Hittites. The Hittites replaced Babylonia as an influential kingdom in the region, and now they were looking around at their neighboring countries and trying to think about expanding their influence. So Ramses was there in the battlefield, and he managed to damage the army of the Hittites. But in doing so, he separated himself from 2/3 of his army, and the city was still controlled by the Hittites. This was a situation when both parties realized that none of them can win. So what do? Well, they decided to collaborate. This is the moment in history when the first peace treaty was signed. They decided to come together and stop fighting and work together and exchange resources and knowledge. And in doing so, both countries flourished so much. The Hittites were very skilled at metalwork, and Egyptians were masters of agriculture and mathematics. And you can see how this collaboration benefited everybody till the end of the Hittites' empire and the end of the reign of Ramses II. And this collaboration continued beyond just Egypt. It was a lesson that we all learned, or at least our ancestors did, to continue collaborating and to work together, to build on the knowledge received by other people. The Greeks learned from the Egyptian, the Roman learned from the Greeks, the Christian learned from the Roman, and finally the Muslims learned from the Christian. And in this entire collaboration, so many discoveries were made, including the discovery of the continent we're in right now. Right now, unfortunately, we are in a time where we are beginning to forget lessons that our ancestors did so much to learn. People who see the world in different ways than us are not accepted as much. We call them names, we label them, we reject them, we even cancel them. And we're no longer happy and celebrating the way that every individual of us is different and brings a diverse point of view. But I don't want this speech to be about the sadness of our world. I want it to be about hope, and especially my source of hope. So you can all find your sources of hope, because without hope, how are we ever going to face our fears? My light in the darkest corners is science. Science as a method to use to go and discover our universe and become really connected to it has been inspiring collaboration for so many years. After World War II, multiple European nations got together and decided to establish an organization to advance our understanding of atoms and to encourage scientific collaboration in the region. The European Council for Nuclear Research, or CERN, had 12 countries at the beginning. Among those countries were France, UK, Germany, and Italy, countries that were truly on opposite sides of the war. But they found it within themselves to work together through what I think is the healing power of scientific inquiry. And look what they have done. What was started by 12 members, who would later become the European Union, now has more than 100 countries from every possible continent working together. The 12 elementary particles I told you about earlier, many of them were discovered at CERN. Even the framework that helps explain how they interact together, or quantum mechanics, was further developed there. People from all possible backgrounds and political points of view are welcomed at CERN and allowed to participate in our mission to advance our understanding of the universe. It's essential for them there to learn, to celebrate what each person brings to the table. I experienced this firsthand. Last summer, I was fortunate enough to be part of the South Pole collaboration at Fermilab, which it is exactly what it sounds like. We have a telescope at the South Pole, and we use it to observe some sort of crazy science thing. We try to use it to understand and observe the oldest light in the universe. And without getting into so much of the physics, we have this telescope that we point at a specific patch of the sky. And we have so many detectors on this telescope that observe very small fluctuations in temperature of the sky we're observing. Those differences can be in 10,000th place, so we have to be extremely precise. And then we make a map of the different regions, and you can see certain regions are hotter, certain regions are colder, and we think this pattern dates back exactly 260,000 years after the Big Bang, when the universe was filled with light. Our universe is 14 billion years old. So for physicists, this is as good as we're gonna get to the early universe. I was working primarily with the Chicago collaboration. So it had about 20 people. There were Americans, of course, there were Germans, there were even Italians and an Egyptian. We were all working together. And it was made clear to me by so many scientists that I should not hold back any questions or any comments because they wanted to learn from my different perspective. They wanted me to participate in all ways possible, not just learn from them. And that was very powerful to me. We also had collaborators from all over the world. Multiple countries, multiple institutions all over the world were present and participating in the South Pole collaboration. And that was not just unique to the South Pole collaboration. Every experiment at Fermilab had some international basis. The bigger, the more complex the experiment was trying to do, the more countries were involved. For example, experiments that's trying to understand the majority of our universe sometimes involve 28 countries and governments. And it just keeps going. It became clear to me that we are at a point in our time when every possible discovery we can make by being alone in a lab and just depending on our own merit and intelligence have already been made. We're at a point when we need every possible innovative idea to keep going, to keep moving forward. And luckily for us, innovative ideas don't just belong to one institution, one continent, or even one country, really. So to keep moving forward, we have to collaborate. And this goes beyond physics and science in general. Every field we have is getting so very complex that we cannot keep moving forward without collaborating and bringing people together, especially people who see the world in different ways than we do. One of the great teachings of quantum mechanics is that it proves to us that try as we might, we can never really determine the future with absolute certainty. We can definitely make conclusions about things that are going to happen in the future, but we're never going to be 100% certain. So this proves to us that we're always going to have questions that are not answered. We're always going to have challenges and problems that we will need people to help us solve because we don't know. So in spirit of curiosity, and since we don't know what we don't know, let's face the complexity and uncertainty of our world by connecting to each other and collaborating. Thank you.
A few months ago, I drove my car to Elkhart to get the airbag replaced. I'd been getting all these recall notices in the mail saying that the airbags I had might explode instead of inflate. But I'd been putting off the procedure because I didn't think I had enough time. A bad reason, I know. Finally made the appointment for a Monday morning in January, and I woke up that day to heavy snow and icy roads. I was still in a pretty good mood as I left the house, singing along to the radio and feeling proud of myself for finally making that appointment, when suddenly my car slid on a patch of ice. That really snapped me out of it. For the rest of the drive, I kept imagining how ironic it would be if I got into an accident on my way to get my airbags replaced. Needless to say, I turned off the radio. I finally got there, handed the keys off to the mechanic, and he told me that the replacement would probably take longer than 3 hours. Then I was on my own. I began walking through the deep snow, looking for a place to spend the morning. And there was nothing. Dunkin' Donuts had a drive-through only sign, and the Golden Egg Pancake House looked like it hadn't been open for years. The only other places nearby were offices. So there I am, trudging along the side of the road, no destination in sight, and I remember feeling a deep sense of embarrassment. I was not dressed for the weather. I had this bag on my shoulder that kept falling off. My hair was blowing everywhere, and I kept slipping on the icy path. I didn't even want to begin to imagine what I looked like to the people driving by me and what they were thinking. Until I realized that on a pedestrian on a busy highway, I was invisible to them. And I'd felt that way before. I began thinking about how little our country prioritizes the safety of pedestrians last summer, while biking across the country with a group of 15 other cyclists. We biked through 13 states from Seattle to Washington, D.C., experiencing a wide variety of terrains and paths, some much better for biking than others. But the place I really became aware of the way that pedestrians are secondary to cars was in Yellowstone National Park. Biking through Yellowstone was supposed to be a highlight of our trip. We had one of our few precious rest days planned there so we could enjoy the park and all the natural wonders it had to offer. Instead, it was one of the scariest places for biking on the trip, at least for me. Rather than enjoying the wildlife and the scenery, I found myself focused on not getting hit by cars, RVs, and trucks as we biked on the narrow shoulder of the busy highways that crisscross the park, the vehicles blasting fumes into our faces as we tried to stay out of their way. Yellowstone is one of our country's first places dedicated to preserving and protecting nature and wildlife. But it is also undoubtedly dedicated to serving cars. So many of our cities and towns embody this Yellowstone paradox. We build cities for people so that human beings can have safe, life-giving places to live and work. Yet ever since the mass production of the automobile, most major cities and larger towns no longer prioritize pedestrians. This might feel like a logical choice for most of us. There are almost twice as many cars in this country than there are human beings. Yet for the 11% of American adults without a driver's license, driving is simply not an option, not to mention those who don't have access to a car or who don't have citizenship status. For so many people, my funny story about walking along the side of the road in the snow with no place to go is an everyday reality. We design our strip malls and our shopping centers for cars with tall, larger-than-life signs that feel impersonal and aggressive to somebody on foot. Parking lots take up huge amounts of space, sometimes more square footage than the actual buildings they serve, and sidewalks are often forgotten or poorly maintained, especially in the most dangerous places, where they're the most crucial. For so many people, accessible and safe walkways can be a matter of life and death. In 2020, Indiana had 45 pedestrian fatalities, according to data from the Governor's Highway Safety Association. And these statistics are even more important when we realize how people of color are disproportionately affected by this poor infrastructure. According to a recent article in the World Economic Forum, there are over 60% more black pedestrian fatalities than white. Not only are our unsafe roadways violent, they're a dangerous example of systemic racism. According to this same article, black households are 2.5 times more likely than white households to live in a neighborhood without a full-service grocery store, and 5 times more likely to depend on public transportation to access vital services and opportunities. What if the closest grocery store was miles away, you didn't have a car, and public transportation was unreliable or unavailable? What if you weren't fully mobile? Small tasks with the car become massive undertakings without one. Grocery shopping, doctor's appointments, job interviews, going to the laundromat, paying your bills. How do you safely and efficiently do these things without a car? We live in a country that prioritizes the bottom line over people. This means creating highways and roads to encourage fast travel, to help people get to work as soon as possible so that we can produce and consume. And we neglect those that we don't see as valuable to our economic structures: the disabled, the mentally ill, the addicted, the immigrant, the poor, the child. If you aren't driving a car in 2022, you are not a fully participatory member of our capitalist economy. You are not important. That is the language of empire. Yet as peacemakers, we must take a different approach. Nelson Mandela once famously said that the true character of a society is revealed in how it treats its children. And I don't think it's too much of a leap to suggest that the true character of a society is also revealed in how it treats those on foot. Making sure that the places we live are built for human beings is an issue of respect, of giving our fellow people dignity and allowing them to take up space. It is an issue of peace and justice. I recently spoke on the phone with an activist from Denver, Colorado, named Jonathan Stalls, who has a website and multiple popular social media accounts under the handle Pedestrian Dignity. He first became an advocate for pedestrians after walking across the country in 2010, from Delaware to Oregon. Ever since, he has been inviting politicians to go for walks with him all across Denver, highlighting areas that are particularly dangerous for pedestrians. He doesn't just talk about the issues. He wants decision makers to feel what it is like. He explained to me that in a car, we are separated from the pedestrian by both the physical structure of the car and the speed at which we are traveling. After all, when you're driving 40 miles per hour down the street, it is a lot easier to ignore a person in need than when you're walking right next to them. Most of the issues Stall sees in Denver can be easily fixed. Slightly wider sidewalks to make them wheelchair accessible. Strips of grass or physical barriers separating the sidewalks from the roads. Elevated crosswalks so that cars are forced to slow down slightly. Making sure that sidewalks don't just end in the middle of nowhere. These steps are simple and affordable changes that any local government can do, here and now. But what will take longer are the deeper cultural changes, shifting our car-centric mindsets and no longer allowing cars to dominate our transportation and communities. And that will be far from easy. Yet I would argue that all of us inherently understand that walkable communities make for happier and more humane communities. In fact, all of us in this room have experienced a place that prioritizes pedestrians over cars, right here at Goshen College. There's a reason that college campuses like this one are so enjoyable to live in. They're designed for people, not cars. But they're not meant for long-term or intergenerational living. Many people look so fondly on their college experience because it is one of the only times in their lives when they get to live in a place that is designed for people. Yet for some reason, we have all accepted that the real world doesn't need or deserve this kind of community, that this way of life is meant exclusively for college. But it doesn't have to be. To learn how to recenter people in our urban design and to envision what our future might look like, Amsterdam might serve as a good model. While we all might think of Amsterdam as a city that has always been dominated by bicycles, in the 1970s, it was just as car-filled as any American city is today. It was only after environmental activists and parents concerned about their child's safety began protesting the way that cars were taking over the city that politicians and city planners began to rethink the direction their city was headed. Their transformation didn't happen overnight, and we can't expect to shift the culture of our own country so quickly. Before we can get to that place, we have to start small. We can find the places in our communities where our sidewalks and walkways are lacking, and we can let our politicians know. We can add inexpensive but humane touches to our streets. We can replace some driving trips with walking or biking, so that we too can feel what it is like for those who have no other choice. At its core, the basic principle of people-centered design is simple. In the words of Jonathan Stalls, It's about knowing that if you fell down on the street, somebody would stop to help you up. Thank you.
Peaceful, warm, comfortable. These are all the things that I'm feeling as I'm laying at bed at 4 in the morning. Deep into the middle of the night, where the entrance to a world unknown to many opens for the everyday migrant factory worker. Soon after I managed to collect my thoughts and get dressed, I walked to the kitchen where I make any last-minute preparations, like checking if there's food in my lunchbox or making sure I don't forget my water bottle or coffee, which are an essential throughout my day. After all my prep is done, comes a peaceful commute to my workplace, where I quickly find out that I'm not alone by any means. I am greeted by the many lights of the different cars, quickly disappearing into other streets, to different factories. And before I know it, I'm at my destination, and work is about to begin. This is the reality for immigrants, part of the 546,000 people in the manufacturing industry of Indiana as of 2021. But believe it or not, there is beauty amidst the long hours or the early wake-up call. At the young age of 17, I was thrown into this world previously unknown to me. Even though my parents had done this labor, I knew that if I was going to begin to comprehend the sacrifice they have been putting in for the better part of 14 years now, I had to do this for myself. When I joined Turning Point, a woodworking factory, I quickly learned the ins and outs of the factory life, like logging in my time card, or the fact that I was going to be assigned a repetitive task, which consisted of me standing there, learning different patterns that I would then have to drill onto the wood. And the workload would vary, anywhere from 100 to 1,000 pieces of wood, with some drilling patterns being more difficult than others. I had to learn fast and needed to work incredibly efficiently in order to be successful, because falling behind schedule is the last thing you want to do, since slowing down production results in unhappy customers, and that could potentially mean me losing my job. It was for this reason that I made speed a priority amongst my work. What was an 8-hour shift then must have felt 16 hours long to me, and the working conditions were completely up to what the weather decided to give you on a particular day. Some days it was very cold, other days it seemed like the heat was relentless, and the perfect weather came rarely and far in between. I was quickly humbled by the tough reality that is the factory life. I had anticipated what was going to be asked of me physically, but I realized quickly that mentally I was far from where I needed to be. I would leave home ambitious and excited and return fatigued and tired. As the days went on, a question would grow exponentially in my head. How do people do this without a sign of tiredness or boredom after all these years? But I realize now that my young teenage mind couldn't comprehend a bigger picture commitment or sacrifice. And it was because of this that I would soon be humbled, not by the work, but the stories that I would learn as my 3-year journey in factory work would begin. On a gloomy Friday afternoon, I found myself arriving at home after a long day at work. I was exhausted and on the brink of quitting my job. I wanted nothing more than the ability to wake up whenever I wanted, not to be dictated by a triggering alarm clock. So I waited for my mother to come home so I could inform her of my news to quit my job. And it's safe to say she was amused by my never-ending rant. She quickly responded with, "Why do you think I wake up every day, son?" To which I had no answer. It was almost as if the words had been robbed from my mouth. I eventually answered, "Bills? Money?" To which she looked at me amused and said, "Mijo, son, there's food in your fridge, right? Clothes to keep you warm, a roof over your head?" To which I nodded and said, "For us?" To which she simply smiled, got up, laughed, and walked away. It was in this moment not only did I recognize that quitting was not an option, but I realized the selfless nature that came with being a migrant factory worker. And this unique trait would continue to humble me, as well as put into perspective the unique opportunity that the young people of today hold. Going into my third year of committing to factory work, I decided to switch to a slightly different factory, a bigger factory. I eventually landed on Lippert, Plant 50, a mattress assembly plant where I worked alongside my mother. I knew that this setting would present its challenges, but I was more than ready to take them on. These challenges consisted of long 10 to 12-hour shifts where I would be asked to go and lift 30 to 50 pounds of material, sometimes put them on my shoulder, carry them to where they were asked for, install them into the machines, and let the cutters continue with the mattress assembly process. And I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. Some days the temperatures would reach anywhere from 80 to 90 degrees, where I would be drenched in sweat, absolutely covered. But even when your day is over, comes the tough reality that you have 3 or 4 more days of this before a very short-lived weekend break. But little did I know that the people that I would meet there would change the trajectory of all of my goals moving forward. During my breaks, I would find myself more eager to initiate conversations with the many peers that I had around me. And eventually, I started doing so. I would learn about how the dedication to this type of work didn't come from any materialism or weightless values like pure self-benefit or greed, but it came from possibly attaining a better life for themselves and for those around them. But they also did make confessions to me. They admitted that the hours did take a toll on them and that the future was constantly in question. They also made it abundantly clear that the timeline in this type of work was purely at what your body could handle. One day, my coworker Martin made a confession to me. He told me, "Muchacho, boy, some days I think of the hours and the work and want nothing more but to stay home and sleep. But I have a family at home, and slacking off isn't an option that I can comfortably take." By the end of the break, I no longer saw selfless human beings and generic people. I saw people hard at work, trying to provide for those they love back at home. Let that be in their home countries or right here in Indiana. Soon enough, it came to where I was the subject in question. And as soon as they found out that I was a Goshen College student, I could hear the desperation in their voice as they showed encouragement. They would tell me, "We better not see you here in a couple of years. Please aim higher than this, because as much as this life provides for us, it's ultimately a dead end, and we don't want that for you." At the end of these discussions, I found myself making a promise that I would do everything in my power to break the barrier of factory work, but also show them the possibilities beyond all the machinery and the metal walls. I left that summer knowing that if my promise became fulfilled, I would help transcend what people normally thought of when they thought of migrant factory worker. Immigrants manage to put others above themselves and at times sacrifice their own dreams if it means setting up someone else's success. In an individualistic society that's obsessed with one's own personal growth, I was happy that in the exhausting setting of a factory here in Elkhart County, I was able to discover selfless human beings doing everything in their power to set up the next generation for success. But shortly after making this realization, I found out that not everyone in my community was aware or was blind to this reality. I would overhear those in my community speaking of those same workers as pawns to those in higher places. So, I ask all of you here listening to my speech this evening, do not look down on the people working in the factories of Indiana, but see them as the people setting the foundation for so many up-and-coming boys and girls that hope to make a positive change one day. Through the many passions they discover as they progress through life, if not college, then any art or trade they see fit. I myself am a byproduct of this type of factory work. And if it wasn't for the sacrifice my father, Pablo Hernandez, and my mother, Catalina Rodriguez, put out throughout my 20 years of life, then it's safe to say that you wouldn't be hearing my voice this evening. Thank you.
Another round of applause for all the speakers. And now I will dismiss our judges to do the work that they are here to do. While the judges are deliberating, the rest of you are free to step outside and move around. Whether you're here in Humble or joining remotely, I'd invite you to stay with us until the judges return, when we'll announce the first and second place winners in the contest. Thank you. Thank you all for staying. We want to thank the judges for their very fine work. And we are now ready to announce the top 2 winners of the 2022 C. Henry Smith Peace Oratorical Contest. Please come up to the platform as your name is announced. The second place winner and recipient of a $150 award is Bryan Hernandez Rodriguez. The first place winner and recipient of a $300 award and the opportunity to represent Goshen College in the binational competition is Greta Lapp Klassen. Thank you all for joining this evening and staying through to the end. Congratulations to all the finalists, and we invite you to return here in 2023. Have a great night.